still see a major gap of complete governance and complete lineage when it comes to embarking on an AI project. Data is the raw material that AI reasons over, is what we use to train and make our language models become more efficient as time progresses, but trusting your data is really key.
Welcome to the Enterprise Thought Leadership Podcast, where we explore the latest in enterprise trends, tech, and strategy with the top leaders shaping the future.
Welcome to Enterprise Unlocked. I'm your host, Radhika Mukherjee, Editor-in-Chief of Enterprise Talk. Our guest today is Jamie Devlin, Senior Director of Sales Engineering at Rocket Software. Jamie drives enterprise transformation in data, security, hybrid cloud, and infrastructure. He partners with C-level leaders to unlock greater value and longevity from mainframe investments. He also guides organizations through complex modernizations journeys to deliver measurable business impact. Welcome to the podcast, Jamie.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
It's great to have you on the podcast, and let's set the stage for our audience. AI readiness is a top priority for enterprises in 2026. But Rocket Software's own research revealed that 66% say that data accessibility is a major challenge. Data lineage and governance are becoming increasingly important for sustainable growth and measurable ROI for AI projects. Let us start with understanding the lay of the land a little bit better. Jamie, where are we in the hype cycle around LLMs and agentic AI for enterprises?
Sure. So I think for Agentic, we're really at that peak attention stage. There's so many pilots, so much activity happening within the accounts that I'm engaged with. Generally, 100 to 150 various pilots taking place, which is enormous, and that isn't all just inside the mainframe legacy side of the environment. It's across the entire operation of a bank or a financial institution. I read that Gartner suggested back in Q2 that around 17% of organizations had actually managed to take the leap and take something from pilot, from an agentic standpoint, and put it into a production environment. I think that's about right from my experience. I do think, though, that organizations running on legacy technology, they'll start to really increase their agentic adoption over the coming 6, 12, 18, 24 months as it becomes more accessible to get into the environments and operate with various LLMs and agentic frameworks in that environment.
Right. What about LLMs?
Yeah, I think LLMs, we're seeing them become more easily accessible, if I can say that. They're easier to implement, easier to use. They are easier to tune. You're easier to get something that's more industry specific and tailored specifically for your use case. They're easier to train. So I think we've very much plateaued from where we were, looking back 18, 24 months ago.
Very interesting. And what's the biggest challenge for AI readiness in enterprises, especially in legacy and regulated spaces?
Yeah, it's great question. And it's quite incredible actually understanding critical environments, legacy environments, mainframe environments. Having those skills to do that is still a major blocker for a lot of the organizations that we see. It used to be that the default route into the IT industry was the mainframe industry, right? That's many decades ago now. And for sure, there are many organizations that run educational bodies and banks and insurance companies that run mainframe skills and legacy technology skills. But actually, those skills, they still are few and far between, and it's harder to train and retain those people within an enterprise. So really, access to data, understanding the data ecosystem. If you look at a mainframe, look at a legacy technology platform, the data is not always in a nice relational format, right? You've got list databases, hierarchical formats. Yes, you've got some relational too, but actually getting to that data, understanding that data, that's a really fundamental challenge before you're really ready to roll out, large-scale enterprise agentic frameworks.
Completely makes sense. So what's the most urgent issue in the world of AI? Computing power or data lineage or even governance?
I think it's far more on the lineage and governance sides rather than the computing part, from my experience at least. Like I said just a few minutes ago, the LLMs are easier to get to, they're more refined, they're more tuned. But actually, I still see a major gap of complete governance and complete lineage when it comes to embarking on an AI project. And you absolutely need to know if data is current and permitted and fit for purpose and accurate and so on. It's very easy to just spin something up with an LLM and some local data, but actually without the lineage and understanding that data and having some rules of governance in place, that's where you can see things start to fall down. So I would say that's a more urgent issue than the pure raw computing power and pushing an LLM.
With the centrality of data, tell us a little bit more about the importance of data at a basic level and maybe a high level as well for AI implementation.
Yeah, absolutely. So data is, of course, I think it's probably the most important asset to an organization, right? We talked about at the start of this conversation, the amount of activity we see, 100 to 150 various projects, and everything is focused around data. Data is it's the raw material that AI reasons over, is what we use to train and make our language models become more efficient as time progresses. It's the engine that keeps things moving. But from a more strategical level, I think organizations that look at their data as an asset and a way to get ahead of their competition inside of their markets, they're going to be the ones that most succeed. And this is really achievable when you look at the mainframe and you look at legacy environments. You've got many decades of really created business intelligence, business information. And what this is giving you is this is, our organization's understanding of the market we're in, right? This is how our customers behave. This is how we operationalize. This is how we measure success. This is how we measure failure. So unlocking that data so we can train and differentiate our LLMs in comparison to our competitors in the market, maybe using synthetic or training data. That's from a strategical perspective. I think that's where we see organizations really start to push ahead.
And what's the importance of trusted data in this equation?
The word trust is being used a lot. And from my experience of particularly the last 12 to 24 months, we are seeing not only data teams, but data teams working with security teams in a much closer way. There's a much more synergy between those two teams, much more so than there has been, in my opinion. Of course, when you've embarked on any data project, when it was analytics or business intelligence, you had to be able to trust the data that was there, trust the framework that's there. But actually, we've progressed really so far in the last few years that, of course, quality, freshness, lineage, very important, but trusting your data is really key. And if you look at all the various stages within your data ecosystem, so you'll have an original system of record, potentially some batch files, some ETL jobs, some change data capture, you'll have analytics platforms, some kind of streaming service. The data ecosystem is so vast now, and AI having access to that data is such a massive problem for us to tackle. You have to be really clear at who can access what data set, what the sensitivity rights, what the permissions rights are. All of those stages I mentioned, all the way through the ETL and CDC process, analytics process. As soon as data becomes or it lands in a local file, it becomes an asset that anyone could just run with. That's where the trust starts to break down in my experience, and users can get unauthorized access and start to manipulate prompts and so on. So you've got to build up trust. You've got to have a data team working really closely, hand in hand, with a security team.
Yes, I can imagine. And it occurs to me that agentic AI makes this even more complex. Do you want to maybe look at that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think where you start to see, I suppose, decisions being made on data, right? So where you have a workflow or decision being made, and you're not just looking at a LLM from, hey, I need some information, I need some data that I can work on a use case. The ramifications for untrusted data are far greater, right? Because you look to have decisions being made on incorrect data, something that's not trustworthy. It can impact your end users, it can impact your internal users, your external customers. And then you start to talk about business risk rather than, accelerating business value with an agentic framework.
So, what are some safeguards that you absolutely recommend to your clients, especially around agentic AI and trust and data and access points?
Yeah, absolutely. So we look at mapping from a security standpoint is really important to us, like we've just mentioned. We've got to look at use cases. We've got to look at permitted data sets. I think one of the more successful operations that our customers go through is building in a business glossary, right? Something that looks at your data inventory, it looks at your lineage, it looks at your ownership and sensitivity, and it starts to map some of the technical paradigms you have behind the scenes in your mainframe environment, and it starts to put in a business glossary, a data inventory that says, look, this is all the data points we have. This is who has access. This is how it's governed. But this is also the intended use of that data. So we know exactly the customer record or inventory record or stock record has come from a particular place for a particular reason. And that helps to build up some confidence in it from an end user perspective. And then, of course, into an agentic perspective as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good segue to the next question, which is what's the mandatory first step for any AI project in 2026 with respect to data?
Yeah, so that's a really key point. I think exactly as we've done, we need to look back and build out a business glossary like we've mentioned. You've got to be super clear on data inventory, ownership, and security. We actually think about reviewing the tools that are in place as well. So one thing that customers have got to be very clear on is replication, whether you're doing CDC, whether you're doing API access, whether you're virtualizing your data. All of these things, they need to be reviewed, I would say, because what suited your data framework for an analytics perspective, it might not be the same when you're looking at what needs to be reviewed for an AI or an agentic perspective.
Let's look at the flip side then. What are the challenges that emerge when enterprises deploy AI without addressing data foundation and strategy issues?
Yeah, so you could very quickly run into issues at that point. So for me, a few things that you need to be thinking about here. The replication and latency is a huge thing. When you start to look at agentic frameworks, they're making decisions. They're not just providing you with information. And I think we've all read the headlines, right, where a production database is taken offline or some system outage has happened. A decision effectively has been made that a human wouldn't have made, right? Something catastrophic potentially has happened to your organization. So you need to look at data replication, whether you think latency is potentially one of the number one indicators in your data framework, whether latency is acceptable at current rates, if you need to look at live data, because ultimately what you're going to do if you don't look at those metrics and look at that framework is you're going to erode end user confidence. You're going to have end users, internal, external, that don't trust what they've got in front of them. And then, like we said earlier, you start to damage your internal processes, damage your customer reputation, and you create issues rather than creating value.
That does not sound good at all, of course. So, continuing down that same path, what are the implications of AI working on stale or even siloed data? And how can enterprises ensure fresh and relevant data is supplied to AI?
Yeah, I think we kind of maybe covered that a little bit in the previous answer as well, but certainly like we mentioned, agentic frameworks, because they're decision based, you've got to ensure that the data they've got access to is correct and is up to date, and is that latency aspect is really being considered. A lot of organizations have moved away from the traditional, if I can call it, a slower processing of data, the ETL process, where you're moving huge amounts of data. A lot of customers now, they need to be far more dynamic, right? So real-time access to data and virtualization to data absolutely is important here. But what's really critical to understand is where you need to combine that with MCP access and tool access, because not only do you need the data to get your agentic framework to work, you also have to have that in combination with some kind of tooling or some kind of system. So that's a complete review that you have to go under to combine your backend data systems with your MCP tooling and making those level of decisions.
And what's the secret to scaling beyond the pilot for AI implementations? And does it differ for, let's say, LLMs versus agentic AI?
Yeah, I think it does, and it's fundamentally with an LLM. It is easier to work in a silo, right? You can sit behind your laptop, you can grab an LLM, you can start working with data, and it's easier to be kind of absorbed by a use case, and you're not thinking of the grander scale, and you're not thinking of the grander sort of industrialization of what you need to do to be successful when it comes to an agentic. And for all the reasons we described, you can introduce so many more risks, so many more variables. As soon as you start looking at enterprise level deployment, what looked great in your laptop a couple of years ago using an LLMs of data, that comes under far more scrutiny when you look at organizations that are taking mainframe data and distributed data and cloud access and whatever tooling they're accessing through MCPs. They're potentially looking at hundreds, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of data points across all of their platforms. So you've got to be absolutely laser focused on ensuring you've got reusable architectures, ensuring your data access that we discussed, ensuring that's consistent and in place. But importantly, you're looking at this from a platform perspective and not the use case perspective. So whether that's API access or model orchestration or shared prompt libraries, whatever facet that's going to be, you've got to be thinking platform and not use case. Otherwise, you're really going to struggle to get an agentic workflow adding the value you think it is going to add.
Yeah, absolutely. When you mentioned the processes, it occurred to me that it might differ a little basis the kind of size of company. So, do you have like a little bit of advice for, let's say, a small to medium company, enterprise level companies?
Yeah, in terms of deploying an agentic workflow.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. So absolutely. So I think my experience personally comes much more from enterprise level engagement. So if you look at a mainframe customer, they are typically they're in banking. It's going to be finance, some of the bigger government organizations, some of the bigger retail organizations, but you're typically looking at global organizations rather than the sort of smaller to medium size. We are starting to look a little bit at the agentic side of things on the mid-tier, so the sort of mid-range platforms, and not necessarily the IBM, the IBM mainframe sort of enterprise platforms, but the medium-sized business, proving out the return investment there seems to be a little harder. There's quite a lot of upfront investment, so looking at more of the enterprise level seems to be an easier way to go, to be honest with you. And I think a lot of this comes down to planning and governance, right? You've got to have a governance process from all parts of your organization that says, look, any use case that you're looking at, as soon as it becomes more than just an idea in your brain, it's got to be taken to a central organization that has people from your senior leadership team, your IT teams, of course, your security, your data teams, the operational side of your business. And you've got to have an organization of people that say, look, this is the use case, but we're also considering a use case over here in this part of our organization. There's some crossover. What tools should we use? What LLMs should we use? How should we deploy that? How do we secure? How do we deploy the data correctly? I think as soon as you start talking, at an enterprise level, you've got to have an enterprise process in place before you're ready to roll out anything into a production environment.
And so the rigor, I guess, is what that doesn't have to be looked at with such kind of intensity when it comes to a smaller organization, I suppose. I mean, can the processes be a little more relaxed or the timelines different?
Yeah, I suppose relaxed is maybe a word. I think there's less resources to put that level of investment into it. Of course, compliance and regulation standards are driving a lot of that in the bigger organizations, and that's less of an impact in the sort of smaller to medium-sized enterprises. But ultimately, like we said earlier, you want to have control and governance, but I think it's a much more smaller resource that those kind of organizations can put into that kind of effort.
Yeah. So if you, let's say, have access to all the resources in the world, of course, you're going to be able to do a great job at this, right? Just if you get your processes right. But let's say you don't have access to that many resources. What's your advice to these kind of companies?
Which resources are you talking about there?
Like if you're a medium-sized company, you don't necessarily have access to such a huge team or that level of budget or even such mapped out processes. So how could they find a middle ground through all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think looking at the elements that are going to provide, I think probably the most most return on investment for you is probably a sensible place to approach. A lot of customers are looking for LLMs and agentic frameworks that are going to give them some degree of automation, I suppose. That's a great thing for them to start looking at. If you don't have a whole governance practice in place, there's tools and external products that you can use to help you get up to speed quickly. I think that's probably a good way of looking at it. If it's reduction in call handling time or customer handling time, there's external things you can do, but I still think that running an internal governance board would be the best way forward.
Totally makes sense. What have you seen in your experience of which departments in an organization are really going forward with AI projects?
So it's being driven really across the enterprise. What I'm really starting to see now is IT teams starting to push agentic exercises, which is really for us quite exciting. We're starting to see more than just that sort of automation use case, like I mentioned earlier, and we're starting to see organizations look at slightly more compelling events, I would say. So we've had some system outage, we've had some downtime in our environments. From a security standpoint, maybe we've failed an audit, and we're now starting to flip it on its head and say, right, well, if a customer has assigned business resilience or assigned business continuity teams within their IT departments or assigned security teams, how can we help them ensure those issues are reduced? We shrink those issues out a little bit. We help them better prepare for audits. I think we're starting to see more push from those kind of organizations or those parts of the organization, and not just the end users, like I mentioned earlier, looking to reduce call handling time or looking to reduce processing of an order.
Right. Very interesting. And with all of this in mind, can you give us an example of what AI readiness looks like in practice in an enterprise?
Yeah, of course. So we've talked a lot maybe around the sort of fundamental steps around this. So we've talked around having data lineage, having good data security, and building trust within your organization. We've talked about reviewing data access and understanding where you have a live data requirement or where you can handle some latency. We've talked about security and data architecture and reusable frameworks. We then talked about having some governance on top of that. One of the major pieces that I see, maybe I think we should see more enthusiasm for, is a reflection point back. So once you've deployed something, once you have your use case, you have your workflow, your LLM in place, it's really important, as it's always been for data projects, to go, right, how accurate is this process we put into place? What's the adoption level? Are people still using it? Are we still getting the level of accuracy that we felt we had? And I really feel that review period to look back and understand that adoption and accuracy is something that customers have got to do on top of everything we've discussed today.
That's a really great, I think, rounding off almost of the discussion. So my last question to you is, how can organizations ensure ROI and measure that ROI accurately for AI projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few ways of looking at this, and we talked a little bit earlier around automation. My concern around looking at AI as purely a way to automate is automation doesn't necessarily give you a return on investment, right? You can reduce a call handling time from minutes to seconds by an automated process. But if we're just reinvesting our effort into other areas, is that exactly what we mean by ROI? So, like I said, you're much better off. My perspective is looking at something that has attributed budget. Look at an objective an organization has, not just a KPI. Look at something that is strategical for the organization. I mentioned earlier that there's, of course, IT-driven projects around business continuity and business resilience. But actually, where is the organization looking to get to from a strategical standpoint? Is there new markets we're looking to break into? Is there particular customer success metrics we're looking to break into? Is there particular global initiatives we'd like to achieve? And what can AI do there? Because innovation tends to see the greatest level of investment. And if you can petition some of that into what you're achieving with AI, I think that's a stronger conversation than purely just automating a phone call or automating a call handling process.
Absolutely. And are you seeing, your clients and those you advise derive real ROI from these projects?
I believe we're starting to get there. Yeah, I think because of this sort of peak attention stage that we're in at the minute, there's a lot of exploration for use cases that aren't necessarily bringing back ROI, in my opinion. There's a lot of exploration and people trying to understand just what's doable and what's achievable. I think we are now at the phase now where we're building business cases. We're understanding really painful events that customers have gone through, like I mentioned earlier, system downtimes or system outages. And we're able to build a business case to say, look, we can shrink those issues, we can reduce that time, we can help you achieve that compliance quicker. And I think whatever industry you're in, that's an easier way to build the ROI. And I do feel that we're at the early stages of achieving that.
That's amazing news, actually, and it answers a lot of questions that we've been exploring on the publication as well. So thank you so much for that. This was such an amazing conversation, and I'm sure it will help enterprises drive much better returns from their AI projects. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Unlocked.
Not a problem. Really, really nice to speak to you. Nice to meet you. My pleasure.
It was great. Absolutely. Thank you. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Keep listening to Enterprise Unlocked.
Thank you for joining us for the Enterprise Thought Leadership Podcast. Please do follow us on social media and subscribe for more ideas and insights. Until next time.